offense of attempted murder, in violation of Revised Code Section 29.
So you said something in your body did what?
Nah, the material, put it like that, the material using my body is stabbed place.
And so she just got stabbed.
Yeah. You know, it's not
Since
me.
they did that,
I'm talking about this for no
now they gotta
reason.
investigate the material my body exposed to.
Since they want to do all that, now they got to investigate.
It's funny because she's from the Ukraine. She's from Russia, and you know they got a war. They had a war going on against the United States.
That's
So I'm just trying to understand.
I don't
how
have
people
nothing.
work that.
They just lashed out on her. That's what happened. They lashed out on her. Whoever was working the material? Whoever was working the material, they lashed out on her.
The Zarutska family's demands went far beyond a simple call for justice. What they wanted was true accountability, not just for the man accused of killing their daughter, but for the system they believed had failed her at every level. To them, Aina's death was not an isolated tragedy but proof of deep cracks in public safety. They described Charlotte's transit network as a fragile system with almost invisible security, private security contracts with no real oversight, and safety measures that were either absent or ignored. In their eyes, her murder wasn't just the act of a single violent individual, it was the result of systemic negligence that had left countless passengers vulnerable. When the accused, Carlos Brown, appeared in court for his bond hearing, the family's grief turned into a moment of raw confrontation. Aina's uncle stood, his voice heavy with pain, and addressed not only the judge but also the man sitting before him. The man accused of brutally ending his niece's life. He described Aina as a gentle, radiant soul, a young woman who carried warmth and kindness wherever she went. She was our sweet angel, he said, reminding the courtroom of the light she brought into their lives. His plea to the court was simple but urgent: do not release this man. He warned that Brown was a danger not only to his own family but to the community at large, a threat who could destroy more innocent lives if given the chance. But alongside their legal fight, the family faced another devastating reality: the digital afterlife of Aina's final moments. Video footage of the attack had spread online, turning their private grief into a public spectacle. And so, the family made a plea that should have never been necessary. They begged people not to repost, share, or circulate the video of their daughter's death. To them, it was not just disturbing, it was a violation of Aina's dignity. Yet the fact that they had to voice such a request at all exposed a darker truth about today's world. We live in an age where even the most sacred moments of loss can be stripped of humanity, where tragedy is consumed, reposted, and rebranded as content. For the family, this wasn't only about justice in a courtroom, it was about reclaiming their daughter's memory from a culture that too often treats human suffering as entertainment. The tragedy did not remain a local story for long, it was quickly thrust into the center of America's political battlefield. President Donald Trump seized on Aina's murder, framing it as the latest evidence of what he repeatedly labeled as failed democratic leadership. Standing at the podium, he held up photographs of the young woman, presenting her not just as a victim, but as a symbol of what he described as dangerous policies. He called her a beautiful young girl with a magnificent future, taken far too soon, emphasizing the sense of promise and hope that her death had destroyed. As his speech continued, Trump's tone hardened, growing increasingly aggressive. He declared that the only way to confront violent crime was with equal force. We must respond with strength. We must be as vicious as they are. It's the only thing they understand, he warned, a statement that drew both fierce support and sharp criticism. For his base, it was a rallying cry. For opponents, it was language they said would only inflame divisions. The White House followed up with a formal statement, not just expressing condolences but accusing mainstream outlets of deliberately ignoring the story until the president himself drew attention to it. They argued that the true scandal was that Brown had been walking free at all. According to officials, his release earlier that year, approved by a local judge, represented a catastrophic failure of the justice system. They insisted that if the courts had done their job, Aina would still be alive. Federal authorities also turned up the heat. U.S. Transportation Secretary Shaw Duffy announced that her office was investigating security failures in Charlotte's light rail system. She went so far as to threaten to withhold $50 million in federal transit funding if the city could not prove that meaningful safety improvements were underway. It was an extraordinary move, using financial leverage as a way to force reforms. Outside government, influential voices joined the debate. Elon Musk, the billionaire entrepreneur known for weighing in on controversial issues, publicly criticized Charlotte's leadership, echoing calls for accountability. On the other hand, Charlotte's own mayor, Vi Lyles, struck a more somber tone. She described Aina's death as a senseless and tragic loss, urging her community to mourn with respect while also confronting the uncomfortable truths the case had exposed. The shock of Aina's death was not contained within Charlotte's city limits, it reverberated across oceans. News of the tragedy quickly reached Ukraine, her homeland, where government officials and ordinary citizens alike reacted with sorrow. For a country already scarred by daily violence and loss from war, the murder of a young refugee on American soil carried a painful symbolism. It was a cruel twist. A girl who had fled conflict in search of safety had been struck down in the very place where she believed she would finally be secure. Ukraine's Ministry of Foreign Affairs described the killing as heartbreaking and deeply tragic. The Ukrainian embassy in Washington went a step further, offering to assist the Zarutska family in repatriating Aina's body so she could be laid to rest in her homeland. To many, this seemed like a natural act of respect, a way of bringing her back to the soil she was born on. But her family made a different decision. One that revealed just how deeply Aina had embraced her new life in the United States. They declined the embassy's offer. Instead, they announced that she would be buried in America, the country she had come to love, the place where she had built friendships and dreamed of her future. To them, this was not a rejection of her Ukrainian roots but a way to honor her wishes. By laying her to rest in her adopted home, the family underscored that Aina's story was not just Ukrainian or American, it was both. It was a tragedy that tied two nations together in grief. In the days that followed, the legal process moved swiftly. Initially, Brown faced a state charge of first-degree murder under North Carolina law, a charge that alone carried the possibility of life without parole. But the gravity of the crime, coupled with the public outrage it generated, drew the attention of federal authorities. On September 9, the U.S. Department of Justice announced it was stepping in with additional charges. Federal prosecutors indicted Brown under a rarely used statute, causing death on a mass transportation system. This wasn't just another legal formality, it elevated the case into the highest tier of federal crimes, one punishable by life imprisonment or, in extreme cases, the death penalty. The announcement sent shockwaves through Charlotte, signaling that the government viewed Aina's murder as not only a personal tragedy but a national matter of public safety. At a press conference, U.S. Attorney Russ Ferguson, himself a Charlotte native, spoke with visible emotion. He reminded reporters of the pride the city once felt when the light rail system opened, a symbol of progress and modernization. Now, he said, that pride had been replaced by fear. This is not just about one man's crime, Ferguson declared. This is about protecting a community, about making sure every parent, every commuter, every child, can step onto public transit without wondering if they'll make it home. Behind the scenes, investigators suggested that the case might expand further. They revealed that they were reviewing Brown's history, his associations, and his motives. Among the possibilities being weighed, federal hate crime charges. While officials stopped short of making accusations, the mere mention raised the stakes even higher, turning a single act of violence into a potential test case for how America confronts bias-driven attacks in public spaces. It's a question that has shadowed courtrooms for centuries, one that forces jurors, judges, and the public into uncomfortable moral territory. Is someone who kills while suffering from mental illness guilty in the same way as a cold-blooded murderer? Or do they belong not in a prison cell, but in a psychiatric ward? Legal history is littered with cases that put this dilemma on full display. In 2001, America watched in horror as Andrea Yates, a Texas mother, drowned her 5 young children in a bathtub. Her defense argued she was suffering from severe postpartum psychosis. The first jury rejected the insanity plea, convicting her of capital murder. But on appeal, a second jury found her not guilty by reason of insanity. She was sent not to death row, but to a psychiatric hospital, sparking a national firestorm. For some, justice had been served. For others, it felt like justice had been denied. Go back even further, to 1981. John Hinckley Jr. attempted to assassinate President Ronald Reagan, shooting him outside a Washington hotel. Hinckley claimed insanity. And when the jury found him not guilty by reason of mental illness, the country erupted in outrage. Congress moved quickly to tighten laws on the insanity defense, making it harder for defendants to claim. But the stain of that verdict lingered, shaping how Americans viewed mental illness in the courtroom. And the debate isn't limited to the United States. In Canada, Vincent Lee's bus killing in 2008 horrified the world. Lee, later diagnosed with schizophrenia, brutally attacked and beheaded a fellow passenger during a late-night bus ride. He was found not criminally responsible, committed to psychiatric care, and years later, controversially released under strict supervision. For the victim's family, it felt like their loved one's life had been reduced to a legal technicality. These cases remind us of the razor's edge the insanity plea balances on. Mercy for the ill, versus justice for the dead. Which brings us back to Charlotte. To Anna. And to her accused killer, Brown. If Brown's defense team pursues an insanity plea, will her case become another chapter in this long, bitter history? For the Zarutska family, the idea is almost unbearable. To them, their daughter's life was not an accident of illness, it was stolen by a man who made choices, who acted with violence, who left them with an unfillable void. But in the courtroom, emotion does not always outweigh medical diagnosis. Experts will testify. Psychiatrists will be called. The question will not just be what happened that night on the train, but also what was happening inside Brown's mind. And in the end, a jury may have to decide, was this murder, or was this madness? This case is no longer just about Anna. What began as one young woman's senseless killing has now become a flashpoint, a story that has forced Americans to confront uncomfortable truths about the systems that govern their lives. It has ignited debates that stretch far beyond Charlotte. Debates about mental health, and whether the justice system should treat illness as an explanation or an excuse. Debates about criminal justice reform, about bail decisions, accountability, and whether the courts are protecting the innocent or enabling the dangerous. Debates about immigration and belonging, about how a young refugee, who escaped bombs and bloodshed in Ukraine, could meet her end not in war but in the country she believed was her safe haven. And debates about public safety, about whether Americans can step onto a bus, a train, or a light rail car without fear that they might never make it home. For Anna's family, the mission has become painfully clear. They refuse to let her death fade into the endless scroll of headlines. In every vigil, every courtroom statement, every interview, they repeat the same message: this must lead to change. Change in how transit systems protect riders. Change in how courts decide who walks free. Change in how society responds to warning signs before tragedy strikes. Their hope is simple, yet profound, that no other parent, no other sibling, no other community should endure the nightmare they now live with every day. But beneath the speeches, the reforms, and the political battles, one haunting question still lingers, a question that refuses to fade. Will justice truly be served? Will the courts deliver accountability that satisfies both the law and the heart? Or will the complexity of mental health, bureaucracy, and politics leave another grieving family with more questions than answers? The trial will decide Brown's fate. But the outcome will echo far beyond a single courtroom. It will shape how America measures justice, how it weighs mercy against accountability, and how it chooses to protect the vulnerable in the future. And in that way, Anna's story does not end with her death. It continues, in the policies debated, the reforms written, and the hearts she touched. Her legacy is now a test of whether tragedy can truly bring change. And whether justice, in its fullest sense, will ever truly be served. In the days after Ana's murder, Charlotte became a city united in grief. Vigils were held across neighborhoods, from candlelit gatherings in church parking lots to solemn marches near the light rail tracks where her life was stolen. Strangers held flowers, parents clutched their children, and voices broke as hymns and prayers filled the night air. For many, these vigils were more than a ritual of mourning, they were a statement, a demand that her death not be forgotten. The Zarutska family, shattered but resolute, used the outpouring of support to create something larger than themselves. They raised funds not only to cover the crushing cost of Ana's funeral, but also to extend help to other Ukrainian refugees who had fled war and now faced the uncertainty of starting over in America. In their darkest moment, they chose to give hope to others, turning personal grief into a broader act of compassion. But alongside mourning came anger, and anger demanded action. Charlotte's Transit Authority announced sweeping reforms. Officials pledged to deploy more staff at key stations, overhaul outdated ticketing systems, and enforce stricter passenger regulations. They promised that what happened to Ana would not happen again. The pressure reached Raleigh, where Governor Josh Stein publicly called for a stronger police presence on public transit and, more importantly, for deeper reforms that went beyond surface fixes. To Stein, the tragedy highlighted not just a single lapse but a network riddled with vulnerabilities, a system that had to be rebuilt with safety at its core. Perhaps the most striking moment came when one transit official, visibly shaken, spoke bluntly. "The system failed us. Everyone deserves to travel without fear. Accountability for violent crime must always come first." It was a rare admission, a crack in the shield of bureaucracy. For the first time, Charlotte's leaders weren't just offering promises. They were accepting responsibility.